Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of DABCC TV. I'm quite excited about this episode, as always, because we have the guys and gals from Reflex Systems with us, and we've had these guys on the podcast show about a year ago, we think. I didn't go back and look, but I think it's about a year ago, so it's due time we get them back on the show. And this time, instead of doing an audio podcast, we're going to actually let you see it. Because, seeing is believing, and it's always fun, and it makes a lot more sense, right, at the end of the day. So definitely take the time to go through this entire video with us, because I think that you'll really like what you see. So it's fun stuff. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to the guys and gals at Reflex and let them introduce themselves, and then we'll get moving forward with this. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Perfect.
Doug, this is Pete Privateer, President and CEO of Reflex Systems.
This is Mike Wronski, Vice President of Product Management at Reflex.
And Doug, I'm going to try to set the stage a little bit, give you a little bit of background on Reflex Systems, kind of our overall mission, product vision for our product. And then we're going to talk specifically about a new release we have coming out this week, a new functionality called vProfile, which is configuration management for the virtual infrastructure. So if we can go ahead and get started, I have one slide that I'd like to use, which kind of lays out our vision for a virtualization management platform. We call our virtualization management platform Virtualization Management Center, very creative. But we believe that as virtualization becomes more and more mainstream, the cost reductions that virtualization has brought to the table in capital cost reductions, we might tend to give back it through operational expense as we hire more and more people to try to manage the virtual infrastructure. And the same tools, techniques, and processes that we use to manage the physical infrastructure cannot really be used to manage the virtual infrastructure. It's a very different scenario. When I say virtual infrastructure, I think it's important to define what we're talking about here. And the virtual infrastructure has an analog to the physical infrastructure in that we have servers, virtual servers or virtual machines, as we might call them. Might be virtual servers, might be virtual desktops, but we use the term guest or virtual machine to represent the analog to desktops or physical servers. We've got a virtual network. We got virtual storage. But in addition to those components which have their analog in the physical world, we have other components which there are no analog. For example, the hypervisor. In the case of VMware, we're talking about ESX or ESXi, but the hypervisor adds a new layer of infrastructure. And then, of course, the management console for the hypervisor, in the case of VMware, we're talking about Virtual Center, adds yet another kind of layer to that infrastructure. So right away, we have two layers that didn't exist in the physical world, which is one of the reasons that management is very different. The other reason that management is very different is that the virtual world is far more dynamic, orders of magnitude more dynamic than the physical infrastructure. In fact, we have customers that manage actual changes to the infrastructure in the virtual world are measured somewhere in the 100 to 200 and more infrastructure changes per minute. And the tools designed for the physical infrastructure simply cannot keep up with that much dynamic change. So those two things require a different approach and a different set of tools for managing the virtual infrastructure. Now, why a platform? Well, we don't think that it makes a lot of sense to have a lot of isolated point solutions that don't share much information with one another, they don't share a common user interface, and they don't work very well together. We think that the tools for managing and securing a virtual infrastructure need to be tightly integrated. They need to share a common set of data. They need to have a common language that binds them together. There needs to be a common management interface, a common visualization to pull all the different silos of management together. This is something that we really never achieved in the physical world, but we think there's a real opportunity to achieve that level of integration in the virtual world. So in the case of the Reflex's virtualization management platform, we bring together management with our vTrust module, monitoring and analysis with the vWatch module, and today we're announcing the release of our configuration management or vProfile module. All of these are built on the VMC or Virtualization Management Center foundation. They store all their information in a common configuration management database. All virtual objects stored in that database. There's a common language that binds all those things together, which we call Virtualization Query Language or vQual. There's a common discovery and visualization capability, central alerting capability, event correlation, and full policy automation. And then finally, all of these functions have an external API that allows them to be exposed through a web portal for those folks that are building either private clouds or service providers that are providing public cloud interface. So, Doug, that's a brief introduction to our virtualization management platform. Are there any questions there?
No, it all sounds pretty good. I'm excited about the demo.
Okay, well, great. Well, let's go on and dive a little bit into the challenges of configuration management in virtual infrastructure. Michael set the stage for that, and then give you a quick look at the new product.
All right, let's start taking a look at this. Before we got into the demo, I just wanted to really explain some of the drivers for what we're doing here. I think my microphone might have been off. Hopefully you can hear me there.
Yeah,
there we go.
Yeah, we can hear you. I can hear you just fine.
All right, good. So let's just take a look at some of the virtual infrastructure challenges before we get into the actual demo, just to make sure we're talking about the same thing here. As Pete alluded to, we are talking about the configuration of the infrastructure on all the different pillars, and this becomes important because of that scale issue. And there's I think everyone understands the cost savings for doing the consolidation in a 10-to-1 consolidation ratio, that kind of thing. The numbers people toss out, using less hardware for more work. But this new layer, the hypervisor piece and its ancillary components, a lot of pieces to the puzzle. And that can add quite a bit of operational labor on top of the organizations as they grow. And really what we're talking about here is shops that are fairly dove in head first into virtualization. We're not talking about one or two instances of a hypervisor or ESX. We're talking 20, 30, 50, hundreds of servers running ESX, and how do I really manage that and maintain consistent configuration? So things like resource allocation consistent across the board. If you're using the resource pools and features like that inside VMware and you're scaling across multiple virtual centers, you're going to want to ensure that your configuration is consistent across the management element, the virtual center, across the ESX servers, as well as in the guests themselves. And the idea we've come up with is that this tool does provide that leverage and visibility into the configuration of all three of those components. Go over a little bit about some of the differentiators. There are some tools out there from VMware as well as some of the other management vendors that kind of dip their toes into this piece. Where we differ, I think, is pretty significant. So I wanted to cover those, and then we'll get into the demo and how this looks. So the first differentiator is a pretty big one in the fact that we're spanning beyond just the ESX configuration in this release. We are paying attention to Virtual Center itself. And some of this came out of our discussions with some of our largest customers, and out of need from a scale issue as well as other organizational reasons, they have a number of instances of Virtual Center, and they wanted to keep that consistent. So we wanted to make sure that we could cover that piece. And then we also get a little bit of the guest configuration here. And from guest config here, we're not talking about inside the guest. So not the kind of things you would historically expect out of, say, a Tripwire product or what the legacy ConfigureSoft product did before the same product now that EMC has taken it over. where they're getting inside the guest. We're talking about how the guest is configured with relation to the virtualization layer. So things like memory, resource priorities, disk mappings, CPU allocations, and a little bit inside the guest in the fact of what kind of software that's installed in that guest covers, spans into this as well. But really, we stay outside and really focus on the infrastructure. Second one, for those of you that are listening or watching that are not familiar with Reflex and seen our other product, the current product releases, everything we do has a strong visual component to it. And so we wanted to make sure that this did as well. So when we're trying to visualize inconsistencies or differences in configuration, I think everyone understands how to do that with one or two things. If you've got a basic tabular view or Excel spreadsheet, you can make a basic comparison between two sets of data. We start talking about ESX hosts that have 2,000 plus configuration parameters, virtual center with thousands of configuration parameters. How do I visualize there's differences across 100 instances of ESX and see where the differences are? And we think we've come up with a very interesting and novel way to visualize that. When I jump into the live demo, we can take a look at that. We're also exposing better ways to look at information in a tabular view. So instead of just a straight table, the product lets you build your own custom pivot tables for data that you're interested in. Once you've kind of used the visual piece to narrow down what's of most importance at the time. There's also functionality that leverages the ability to compare lots of different pieces. So I can compare defined profiles to other profiles. I can compare profiles to single instances of an object, a single host, a single guest, or I can compare that profile to an entire cluster or entire virtual data center. And being that it's not just a tool for reporting and identification of challenges, we also have multiple ways to remediate. The first one is ad hoc. So right there from the graphical difference or change view, I can see where things are different and then decide what I expect that configuration parameter to be and make a setting change immediately. Being able to do that is very important just from a time to getting work done perspective. And another piece of this is the profiles themselves. There are products out there. VMware's host profiles is perfectly suited for basic changes or basic host configurations, but it's fairly monolithic, meaning that I have to do the entire host config. We let you take a profile that can be as small as a single property. So if you can imagine, if you wanted to break up your profiles into some major areas of expertise, you might have a security profile covering the DISA-STIGs or VMware's hardening guide, just focuses only on how to configure securely an ESX server. Then you may have another profile for your storage, configuring your NetApp, your EMC, or whatever that storage component is. And then you may have another profile for the hardware itself. So, Cisco UCS versus IBM Blades or HP Blades are all going to have specific ESS configurations. Then take those smaller profiles and combine them together to make up your master profile and be able to distribute that around. It also allows you to have your subject matter experts be responsible for different subsets of the configuration and then combine that expertise together as your overall profiles going forward. The historical piece of this is kind of interesting. The existing Reflex products allow you to essentially go back in time from a configuration and visibility perspective. You can look at the old network topology from the past. You can see all the configuration changes surrounding a certain time window. All of that knowledge leads us to being able to define our profiles based on previous events. So if you had a configuration that you liked from 6 months ago, or maybe when you first installed a server, you'd gone through the steps and made sure it was correct. Since then, there's been a lot of drift, and you really can't ensure what the configuration is now. We can let you define your profiles based on how that server was configured 6 months ago, as long as Reflex was installed at that time. It becomes a very useful feature. The typical thought process around baselines is I have to remember to record a baseline at some point in time and use that. But to us, a baseline can be any point in time since Reflex has been installed. Another pieces of this, the remediation side of it, outside of the ad hoc, there's a full set of features on just scheduling those remediations. And maybe during your scheduled downtime, you may want to push out configuration changes only on certain points in time, or do constant comparison. So every morning, go ahead and compare my current set of profiles to my entire data center and let me know if there's any differences in configuration. The feature also becomes fairly useful for batch configurations. It's a very common phenomenon to have a single property that needs to be changed across all of your ESX servers, possibly due to tweaking your storage performance or feedback from VMware or a hypervisor vendor on making certain problems you may have seen. You need to push out that single configuration property. just by adding a new profile with that one property and mapping it to all of your ESX servers or all your virtual centers, you can ensure that that property is pushed across the board. And of course, from the auditing perspective, all of this work and configuration change has a lot of tight audit controls around it, ensuring that whoever is managing and changing configurations, their justification, who did it, when they did it, why they did it, is all recorded in the system as well for reporting purposes. Now we're getting down to the end of this big list. There's one that doesn't really fall into the others, and it might seem a little strange if we don't explain it. But IP addresses tend to fall into this quite a bit. Every ESX server will have at least two, typically for the service console or management. Then you've got your VM kernel for storage, vMotion. So it's great if you can have profiles that have template views for IP addresses. So the Reflex product, for a matter of cloning configurations or standing up new servers, allows you to use a basic IP pool managed inside Reflex to configure those IP addresses. And in future releases, we're working with some of the IP address management or IPAM vendors to try to incorporate over API integration to those vendors so we can have that tight integration with enterprise IP address management for these types of configurations. And the last piece there is property pinning is a superset of our ability to verify configurations. There are certain properties you expect to be consistent and static. Property pinning is a way to apply policy to those properties to ensure that they never change over time. So it's just one extra seatbelt for ensuring configuration.
And Doug, I think your listeners should know that vProfile is again integrated with the VMC platform, Reflex's platform, so that it shares the same objects, same database with vTrust, the security module, with vWatch, the vWatch module. And this is very unique. Mike mentioned VMware has a tool for doing configuration management called Host Profiles, but Host Profiles is not integrated at all with their security management solution. It's not integrated at all with their performance product or anything else. They're a bunch of isolated products inside the VMware's management suite. And this is true of the competitive products as well that are provided by third parties. Only with the Reflex VMC platform is all of that stuff integrated, common interface, common database, and common language, binding all these things together.
So I think that definitely sets the stage for what everyone's probably interested in seeing is what does this really look like. And what I've pulled up on the screen here is a view.
If you don't mind, if I interject, I have one quick question before we get into the demo. All that sounded great. I loved everything that you talked about. But now we're going to move into the demo. So up on the screen, I see the fancy application, right? What does it take to get to this point, though? You know what I mean? So is it a virtual appliance? What does it take to install? What's the backend infrastructure look like? What does it take to get to this point?
Absolutely, that's a very quick question, and we think there's a great answer for this. So total time to install the product and get to where you're seeing now and be able to do what I'll walk you through is about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on networking speeds. We deliver the backend, the VMC piece, as a virtual appliance in the OVF format. So it's as simple as a import from Virtual Center that pushes the machine in there, a quick IP address configuration, setting up a initial administration user. And then you get a familiar web page, very much like how when you install Virtual Center, you can just browse to the Virtual Center server and download the client. We provide the same functionality. So this is a thick Java-based client. You just browse to our virtual appliance, download and install the client, and you get to a view like this once you've logged in. After that, there is a brief harvesting collection period that'll go through and pretty much baseline model your entire virtualization environment. And then from that point forward, it's tracking every configuration change across all of the components.
Oh, very cool, very cool.
Just let me point out on this screen while we're here, we talked about the different layers of the virtual infrastructure, and the representation of that is down the left side. So at the top is a box labeled VMS, Virtualization Management System. In this case, it's Virtual Center. Next is host, which is in this case, ESX host. You can see this is set up to support multiple hypervisors, why it's not specific to just VMware. And then guest configuration, which is the virtual machine configuration. And then, of course, inside the host configuration is your network and storage parameters are included in that. So the layers I spoke of earlier, you can actually see here on the screen.
Very neat. That makes a lot of sense.
All right, and then we can also, just to make a note, when we talk about the different pillars in the VMC products, it all is through a single client UI. So as customers decide to use one or more of these pillars, it's all about license keys. You don't have to install anything additional. So from that one-time first install, depending on the licenses you've purchased, you get access to any part of the content without having to add or modify your configuration, which is, I think, a pretty nice thing to have.
And in fact, at the top, the topology is the vWatch product. Next over security is, of course, the vTrust product. We have standard reporting, which is available, no matter what pillar you purchase. And then, of course, you see them highlighting the configuration management pillar.
All right, Doug, does that answer the question pretty well?
Yeah, no, completely. It's that's simple.
Fantastic.
So we get to this point real easy, and then it goes out and does its thing, and now you're going to show us what we do from there, and it just takes a matter of minutes. So people can also evaluate your product really easy also.
Yep, and that is available for download on the website. So we make it fairly easy for everyone to get a hold of the product, register on the website, and download from there.
Okay.
Which is, of course, www.reflexsystems.com, and from there there's a lot of information on this product as well as the other feature sets. So what we're looking at now is a blank view of the host configuration panel. If we look at the left-hand side here for the VMS or virtual center config or host config or guest configs, we see the same options. I'm going to walk through the host configuration piece because they all pretty much resemble and have the same look and feel. The only difference really is the type of properties that you can build into the profile. So the first thing I'm going to do, so out of the box, if I haven't created any configuration profiles, I just want to compare my data center and see how consistent my configuration is. So I'm going to go ahead and insert the topology of one of my virtual centers. So I'm going to pick an entire virtual center here, and this is presented in a nice tree view, so I could browse it. And I see that familiar structure from virtual center to virtual data center, different servers. So I'm going to go ahead and compare the entire data center to itself and see what that looks like. The blue box in the middle is that visualization graph. So you'll see what this is going through is pulling those configurations off of each one of those elements. And once it's done pulling them, we'll get that difference or difference view shown on the screen. And once this shows up, then I will give you a kind of a walkthrough of what we're seeing and how this visualization works. There we go. So this is not a common visualization unless you're familiar with looking at weather maps. I don't think there's too many products out there that visualize this way. I think there's a couple hard disk products that show disk utilization in a similar fashion. So what we're actually seeing here is the concept of a heat map. So you can imagine watching the Weather Channel and seeing the United States and see the red areas in the south, the bluer areas towards the top. That easily communicates that it's hotter, where the hot spots are, where it's cold. In this case, the hot spots are more differences in configuration or greater inconsistency of configuration, if you will. It's also geographical in that certain areas of this map reference different sets of configuration types. So all of this big red area in the middle is my networking configuration. So things like port groups, virtual switches across my data center are in pretty much disrepair from a consistency perspective, which is pretty typical of a lab environment, but we're not really sure how typical it is of a larger environment. Though the larger they are, I expect the more inconsistencies to have, especially when you talk about growth over time. The servers that were initially deployed in a VMware environment are going to be very different than the ones that are deployed recently. Some of that just comes from better knowledge or difference in hardware. We can see how inconsistencies and drift grows. So the blue areas represent no change. And what may or may not be coming through the WebEx is there's a bunch of little squares that make up the small, and each square itself is a property. So as I move around, there's a property filter at the top that shows me what group I'm in. So this white group that I'm circling my mouse around is all Civic Storage Network port group. If I click on one of the properties, I can see what property that is and exactly what's different about it. So as a tool like this, I can immediately see networking is very inconsistent. The hosts are still fairly inconsistent, but not nearly so as much. Now I'm going to jump into here and filter a little bit. I'm going to remove the networking component. So I'm aware that networking is an issue. I don't really want to focus my time on that now. it's all working, but I want to look at my host inconsistencies. So we provide the idea of an exclusion mask. And these are some canned ones, but you can also create your own. And by exclusion, I just removed all of the configuration properties that have to do with networking. There's a number of other ones in here, the host-specific pieces. We also let you remove things like read-only properties that we wouldn't be able to change. Those are typically things that are like BIOS settings or other information that VMware can read, but we really have no chance of setting through the product. So if we don't care about those, we can remove what we don't care about. Then we get a much more digestible heat map. So now in this view, this is only two different types of settings. On the right-hand side, it's storage configuration, and then everything on the left here in the larger area is just the host configs. So here, when I click on the boxes, it's much easier to see, and I can explain what we're actually seeing here. So this is the hyper-threading available. This is actually a read-only property since I didn't mask those out. What we can see from this is that of the 10 hosts in this virtual data center, the common value is false. So that means of the 10, 8 of them have no hyper-threading available, and only these 2 have it available. So it's very easy to see what's different. For other types of properties, depending on what they are, let me search for one that I know I can set. We can take a look at the time zone properties. So here is a time zone issue. This is the time zone variable. Of the 10, 9 of them have the time zone set to U.S. Eastern, and 1 has American New York. Here's an example of the immediate ad hoc remediation. Over here on the right, if I expect all the servers to be set to U.S. Eastern, I can click Apply here. Or if I expect, the 9 of them are wrong and only ESX9 is correct, I can click Apply on the right, and then everything will get set to American New York. So you can see I can quickly just decide what changes I want to make and apply them in an ad hoc fashion.
Yeah, Doug, and let me just, for your listeners, to make it clear, the redder it is, the more differences there are. You can see the red square. There are, out of 10 machines, 2 of them are different. The yellow heat is out of 10 machines, only 1 is different. So the redder it is, the more inconsistencies there are. Here you see 5 machines that are different out of the 10. So that the color tells you how inconsistent the machines are from one another.
I really like that. I actually use heat maps for DABCC.com because, it's really easy to look at a heat map and see where people are clicking and, maybe optimize things to make it easier for them to find data, right? And at the end of the day, that's what you're doing here is making it easier for them to spot whatever they're looking at, right? Instead of having to bury it inside, tables with a bunch of numbers. That's really cool.
Exactly. Yeah, and we provide lots of searching. So while I was talking about it, I did a quick search for that time zone feature, and it highlighted all the boxes where time zone was one of the configuration variables. And now I just switched back to looking at only the networking piece, so we can talk about another bit of this and look at the pivot table at the bottom. So we do try to make it easy to dig and filter further once we've kind of narrowed it down to a specific area. So with the bottom half of this, pivot table on all the properties. So if I'm looking at only the network port group, the storage network, so I can go ahead and look for that and type properly and look at a couple of properties. In this case, I'll look at the security properties of the certain port group, and I can just drag these into a pivot table and build out my own tables. Really take a look at how these are configured. Let me drag in more of this, and do apologize, we are kind of screen constrained here. The product definitely shows much better on a decent-sized monitor. Once I've built out my pivot table, then it's very obvious looking at differences in configurations at the table tabular view, and if I want to, I can export this out to Excel. So I've got usable data from an interactive perspective, as well as being able to extract it into a tabular form and share that using a common office tool like Excel. Once we have kind of the next step of the use cases of this is we may go through and establish that, well, I've got a big problem here with my storage configuration. I want to make it more consistent. And that's when we start playing with profiles. I've switched myself over to the profile view. And the way we define profiles, I can create my own from scratch, or most likely what you'll do is you go through and actually configure a host or a guest or a virtual center exactly the way you want it, creating that golden master piece of that. And if you do it that way, of course, you get to test all those configurations. You're not guessing on it, does it work or not. but you do have the option. I can start from an empty profile and build out my configurations any way I want. Let's go ahead and just for example case, let's say I'm going to pick, I went ahead and configured one of these servers last week exactly the way I want it. I can choose any time. I'm going to go back to, say, last week, Monday the 15th, and see what was in my network. When I've done that, now we've got 3:15, 1:44 p.m. ESX2 was perfect. Go ahead and leave the default name. But what I've just done is pulled all of the configuration from that ESX server in the past. And now I get a complete list of all of the configurations that are available, and they're all kind of, some of them are collapsed from a networking perspective. I can expand these all the way down to the individual parameters. And now I can go through and either add additional parameters, additional vSwitch configuration, data store configs, excuse me, in a specific profile property. It's all context sensitive, so I can add additional properties anywhere in here. I can also remove pieces. If in this case I didn't want this to have anything to do with anything that wasn't networking, I can pull out pieces of the configuration that I don't want to be in my profile, as well as make changes here. I can define new IP addresses, the Boolean operators I can set. Once I've gone through all of that, I can also decide whether I want a delta or a full profile. And this is the concept of, should this profile be the absolute master? So say if I apply this profile to another host, it would look just like this, or the delta is more of an additive option, meaning that I will make the changes for the properties that are the same or that are existing here and add things, but I will not remove any properties from the destination. So it gives me the flexibility to make a profile that adds the configuration and modifies some versus one that would be a complete wipe of the old settings and replace, wipe and replace. So now that I have a profile configured, they all exist here in a profile view. I can edit them moving forward. They can then be bound to hosts. This call, we probably don't have a lot of time to talk about vQual or virtualization query language. That's a interesting technology that Reflex has that allows us to query the infrastructure and set up classifications or groups or zones. It's also a way to browse our virtualization CMDB. In the config management section, we use it for binding. And by that, so if I pick a host, I want to map to a host, I can say, well, all the hosts in this cluster, all of the hosts with this version of ESX. Any of these things can be vQual queries, and the result set is mapped to the profile.
And this is where integration with the other pillars comes in. So I could say all of the hosts in the PCI trust zone, integrating it with the security pillar. All the hosts that, or all the guests or virtual machines that are running web services, which is integrating it with the vWatch profile piece. So you can, again, apply the profiles to things that you know from the other pillars.
And we don't require you to learn the vQual language. It just gives you that kind of a flexibility to use any of the properties that we know about the virtualization environment to define where you want that profile to exist. We also have the exact same concept of just clicking on the insert topology and picking the host you want to match. So you can do either version of that, either enumerated list. The cool thing about doing the vQual based on properties is that if a new server comes up that matches those properties, that profile would instantly be applied. You wouldn't have to go back through and enumerate. We do give you that flexibility.
So where that would come into play, a use case would be, again, let's take web services. Somebody creates a new virtual machine, loads web services on there. We immediately know that web services is running. We can then send alert to the console, to our management console, and then have someone manually set the configuration. Or if we want, we can actually automate the configuration of that virtual machine. So, that's a use case. Many other use cases, you create a new ESX host that's part of a PCI cluster, has certain networking requirements, certain network configuration requirements. You can either, alert someone to set them or have it set manually depending upon what your policy is.
So once we've got the binding set here, then we've got the policy. I'll run you through what happens once we look at it. I'll manually execute one of these profiles against a host. So we're just going to go ahead and try to go through the steps of applying a configuration to a host. The first thing that happens is we determine what's actually going to get set based on that configuration profile. And we determine also whether or not those set of changes requires a reboot or it's entering in maintenance mode. There are a number of configuration properties that can be done live in a real-time system without any service interruption whatsoever. I haven't chosen any of them here, but when you do lucky enough to choose those, you can tell whether or not that reboot or maintenance mode is required. This also allows the operator to make that decision. Can I make these changes now, or do I have to wait for a maintenance window? I'll go ahead and assume that I want to do this in my maintenance window because I have to do a reboot and maintenance mode is required to set this set of properties. From there, it's a scheduling exercise. One-time scheduling, pick a time and date, but we can also have these kind of application of configurations, repetitive on a recurrent schedule, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, even subsets of that for a certain duration of time. And this is how we can ensure consistent configuration. So if we have a known configuration window for certain assets, so I want to ensure this configuration persists, I can have it validate that config and let me know if there's a difference and decide whether or not I want to apply that, every day, every hour, et cetera, based on that kind of a schedule. Once I've picked it, I'm going to go ahead and do a one-time one here just so we can look at this in a schedule view. I'm going to do it in the future so that it doesn't actually run. So we'll go with 326 and finish that. And then down to my schedule view here, the profile that I've got configured is right there. And have a number of them, and I can go through and edit these as well. Take a look, go back and change all those configurations. So that goes through both a generic comparison of configuration properties, see where the differences are, how do I create a profile, and then how I can schedule it. There's also a tab here for that masks view, and those are those exclusion masks that I talked about. And I can build those manually based on properties, or straight from that graphical view, I can right-click on any of the properties and add those to an exclusion mask so that property wouldn't show up in the graphical view. And we've tried to make this very consistent, so when you're doing this for Virtual Center or guests, it's the exact same process. You don't have to learn a different process. The only thing you're really dealing with different is the properties that are available for profiles. And we could also see here I can apply multiple properties or multiple profiles to a host based on the bindings, which is how I can achieve that tiered functionality. Excuse me. That kind of covers what we do for a host piece. So there's a special case that I want to cover from the Virtual Center side, which we think is kind of neat. And that's this other tab at the bottom here we call migrations. VMS migrations, cluster, and host migrations. And what this allows us to do is use this configuration knowledge and the fact that we've baselined and configured the virtual centers as well to move pieces of infrastructure between instances of Virtual Center. So there we have a customer use case where they would prefer not to upgrade Virtual Center. They want to do a clean version install every time a new version comes out, just from a testing and certification process. It saves them a lot of time. So what we can do is completely extract all of the configurations, say from a 4.0 GA Virtual Center, and move them to a 4.0 Update 1 Virtual Center, and then copy everything across. And by everything here, not just the host mappings, but make sure that the folders, resource pools, and every other bit of configuration, including access controls, moves with an individual item between two virtual centers. So I can do load balancing between virtual centers. If I need to move a resource between virtual centers, I can do that with the migration tool as well. It's kind of a neat additional feature on top of the general configuration management piece.
I like that.
And Mike, I think Mike just touched on that, but I wanted to elaborate a little bit. The vProfile piece, along with vWatch and vTrust security management, are being used by customers out there and are already saving tremendous amounts of time. We have a large customer that has been testing vProfile, and they estimate it's a very large environment consisting of many hundreds of ESX hosts, but they believe that the vProfile product will enable them to not have to hire 30 people. So vProfile will automatically do what it would take take 30 people in their large environment to do. So that's a tremendous savings. Another customer puts it a little bit differently. They believe that with vTrust, vWatch, and vProfile, that they can manage orders of magnitude more virtual machines than they could in the physical or just native VMware environment. They believe it takes one person. In the past, it took them one person to manage and secure every one physical server. With virtualization, they were able to achieve one person managing as many as 50 or up to 100 virtual servers. And with the Reflex technology, they can now bring that to in excess of 500 virtual servers per individual, per person managing and securing those servers. So huge productivity increases. Another customer believes that this will save them weeks upon weeks of work out of their schedule. So I think that it becomes easy to justify deployment of these kinds of tools when you look at the operational costs that it's replacing.
Absolutely.
Any questions or anything on
No, all seems pretty good. I sort of let the listeners on the videos, let the watchers make up their minds. I sort of keep quiet through it, but it all makes sense. I like it. I like the heat map. What are you going to show us next?
Actually, this for the vProfiles feature. This really does cover it. I'm not sure what our time on the phone is today, or how much time we've got left. But we have there's a whole lot of the rest of the product that I think we might be better suited by spending some more time with you and doing a whole separate video podcast where we can get into what we do from a topology perspective and historical views. And it's kind of all of the information that we already gather in existing release products that leads us up to the ability to use the vProfiles feature.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And anytime you guys want to come on and chat about what you do on DABCC radio, I'd love that. Absolutely. So, and it's always best to leave these videos a little bit short and sweet. Let the guys get back to their work, or better yet, get to downloading an eval of this and checking it out for themselves. So that being said, what do they need to do that again?
Just head on over to our website, which is www.reflexsystems.com. From the front page, there's download links that'll get you straight to that. And then there's also a lot of extra material about this feature and the other product features that the Reflex VMC has to offer.
Very cool. Very cool. And then we'll throw some of those links in the show notes of this video podcast. So definitely just, if you're watching it on DABCC.com, just below the video is the show notes. And if you pick this up on iTunes, just head over to DABCC.com/TV. So with no further ado, let's just go ahead and wrap this podcast up. So guys, thank you so much for taking the time to show us the goods and introduce us to your new release.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you having us.
Hey, no problem, and any time. So, as always, the most important people I want to thank is each and every one of the guys out there listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and definitely check out the Reflex stuff. Very, very neat. So, and I just want to say the Reflex Flex. So, I'd be remiss if I didn't do that. So, anyway, that's my joke for the day. Thanks, everyone. Did you catch that? You probably get that quite often, right?
Not as often as we should, I
think. Maybe a good response would be, well, you know what, Doug, we don't really deal with many people as sophomoric as you. So anyway,